Thank you for joining us here in New Orleans. One request we ask, of course, is you silence your phones, but it certainly is my pleasure to officially welcome you to the STS 56th annual meeting. The last time the annual meeting was in New Orleans was back in 2001. For those of you who frequent the annual meeting, you may know we also wanted to hold the meeting here in 2006. But due to the chaos created by Hurricane Katrina, we moved the meeting to Chicago. I'm glad we've finally made it back to the Big Easy. I hope you'll take the time to enjoy the relatively warm weather, as well as the wonderful local culture. Our annual meeting falls in the middle of Mardi Gras season, so be sure to enjoy the carnival, the food, the music, the colorful decorations, but please limit your extractions to those hours when the educational sessions are on break. And after you've been spending some time with our valued exhibitors. This is the second year that we're condensing the annual meeting to a new program. We hope that you'll take advantage of this new schedule before you head back home or to your patients or to your busy practice later this week. We've really an interesting program and planned for you today a keynote lecture and each session that allows time for more interactive and robust dialogue. To help make you aware of everything the meeting is to offer, please make sure you download the meeting app, sts.org/mobile app. Information about downloading the app is available in the meeting bulletin. And we also have a mobile app to help you register and participate. It's important that you use the mobile app because you'll be able to see the full abstracts, take notes, participating in the polling, evaluate sessions, and access the exhibitor listing and exhibit hall floor plan. Please take the time during the meeting to also visit our exhibitors. We have an opening reception that begins at 4:30 this afternoon, right after this lecture, in the exhibit hall on the left. STS, along with many exhibitors, will offer hors d'oeuvres, refreshments during the reception. The Jeopardy Championship begins at 4:45 in the exhibit hall theater. And this year, contestants from Berlin and Ann Arbor, Michigan, will go head-to-head for the championship trophy. It should be very stimulating. Right after Jeopardy, e-poster presentations will begin in the exhibit hall at 5:30, and featured authors will be there to present and discuss their findings, and a panel of experts will select the award winners. You'll be able to view the posters electronically throughout the meeting. Several monitors will be available in the exhibit hall and around the convention center, and these will be available on the mobile app as well. Tonight, I hope that you'll join us as well for the President's reception. It will be at Mardi Gras World, and you'll get a behind-the-scenes look at how the vibrant, show-stopping floats are created. Please check the registration desk if you haven't purchased a ticket, and we'd love to have you join us. Shuttles begin to arrive from the convention center at 6:30, and the three main STS hotels also will have transportation. Now, before we introduce our new keynote speaker lecture and our exceptional inaugural speaker, I would like to thank some people, in particular, Dr. David Cook and Dr. Jennifer Lawton, and the rest of the annual meeting program committee for putting together a terrific educational lineup. Thank you very much, David. And as all of you know, none of these things could happen without outstanding staff. And we want to congratulate and thank our Society of Thoracic Surgeons staff who work diligently day and night throughout the year to put this program together. This meeting could not have come together without them. Many of them are from us and with us here in New Orleans. They make a very complicated task look very easy, and they are keeping our society humming in addition to planning the annual meeting. STS staff members are wearing gold ribbons, and if you need assistance during the meeting, please check out one of their staff members who can be able to provide you with assistance. I'd also like to take note of our sister societies who either have officers or other representatives in attendance at the meeting and who have helped develop one of our sessions this week. The American Association for Thoracic Surgery, the American College of Cardiology, the Asian Society for Cardiovascular and Thoracic Surgery, the Canadian Association for Thoracic Surgeons, the Canadian Society of Cardiac Surgeons, CHEST, the European Association for Cardiothoracic Surgery, the European Society for Thoracic Surgery, and the International Society of Heart and Lung Transplantation, the Society of Cardiovascular Anesthesiologists, and the Society of Vascular Surgeons. All of these are contributing to our success as a society and as a member organization. Thank you very much for your friendship and your support. As most of you know, 75 years ago, Dr. Alfred Blalock and colleagues, guided by the watchful eye of a steadfast laboratory assistant, performed the first blue baby operations on a small child at Johns Hopkins Hospital. That frail 18-month-old with tetralogy of Fallot benefited from an extraordinary team effort that included legends of surgery like Longmire, Cooley, and Helen Taussig. They collaborated and successfully created a shunt that increased blood flow to the lungs and initiated the dawn of a new era in cardiovascular care. But this would not have been possible without the courageous friendship between Blalock and his assistant, Vivian Thomas. Vivian Thomas was a black carpenter's apprentice with a genius for surgery. And although Thomas never attended medical school, he stayed in the teaching ranks and trained dozens of residents. After 30 years at Johns Hopkins, he was honored with the title of Instructor Emeritus in Surgery. But it was Thomas's collaborative efforts with Blalock that unlocked the future of cardiovascular surgery. We recognize these efforts with pride and respect for what can be accomplished in even the most challenging of times. I am very pleased that the STS added this keynote lecture in honor of Vivian Thomas. And I want to welcome to the stage David Cook, Program Director, to introduce our first Vivian Thomas lecturer as chair of the workforce on the annual meeting. David, please join us. Thanks, buddy. Good luck.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. The significance of the Vivian Thomas Lecture is not only to honor Thomas's legacy, but also to celebrate the diversity of all members of the cardiothoracic surgery team and the cardiothoracic surgery community. Our inaugural Vivian Thomas Lecturer, Dr. Clyde Yancey, is the Vice Dean for Diversity and Inclusion and Chief of Cardiology, among other positions, at Northwestern Medicine in Chicago. He was born in Louisiana, but later moved to California, where he stayed until he entered medical school at Tulane University right here in NOLA. After graduating, he was a resident at Parkland Memorial Hospital in Dallas, and later completed fellowship in both cardiology and transplant cardiology at the University of Texas Southwestern Medical Center, where he remained for many years directing the heart transplant program there, while simultaneously running the heart and lung transplant program at Baylor. Although very busy clinically, he also immersed himself in research and noticed a worse response rate when treating Black patients with heart disease. It was through that research that Dr. Yancey was able to link chronic hypertension with heart failure and authored the book, The Role of Race in Heart Failure Therapy. Over his career, Dr. Yancey authored numerous peer-reviewed papers, received many teaching awards, and his impressive scientific achievements have brought him international recognition. He has served on the Executive Council of the Heart Failure Society and as president of the American Heart Association. He is also an elected member of the National Academy of Medicine. It is now my distinct pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Clyde Yancey.
Good afternoon. Please let me know that everyone can hear me well enough. Good afternoon. Are you sure you can hear me well enough? Good afternoon. That's good enough, yeah. I am very, very elated to be here for multiple reasons. The first is that I was the recipient of an incredibly generous invitation from a dear friend and colleague, Dr. Higgins, about 2 years ago when I was visiting professor at Johns Hopkins. It was still formative, but the concept was so robust that I indicated to Bob that I'd be happy to do it, just develop the idea further, and let's protect the dates, and he did such, and I'm grateful to him for that. I'm also grateful that this is here in New Orleans. I grew up in Baton Rouge, actually Scotlandville, Louisiana, and lived here in New Orleans during my time at Tulane, and then for my first faculty appointment as an academic physician in general internal medicine at Tulane. So those 5 years were pivotal in my life. I met my children's mother here and had dinner at the restaurant last evening where we had our first date 40 years ago. So for that opportunity, I'm very grateful. I'm also grateful to be out of the cold weather Chicago for a weekend. And I'm grateful I have received my year's allotment of gumbo and red beans and rice. But beyond that, I want to thank the planning committee, thank Dr. Cook for the work that he's doing to help your society become more aware about issues of diversity. Planning committee includes my good colleague at Northwestern, Dr. Malazare. So thank you for being on that committee and really understanding and appreciating the importance of having these kinds of discussions. But let's begin. I wanted to talk to you about the aura of this Vivian Thomas Memorial Lectureship. I am beyond humbled to be the first person to deliver this message. But you can see I've subtitled this presentation, a lecture about discrimination, segregation, and bias, and I've tried to provoke you by suggesting, could this happen again? I think if you work with me over the next several minutes, you'll discover some very interesting dynamics here that would argue that we're in a much better place now than we were before. This is the man. You see him in the portrait that was commissioned by the leadership in Hopkins. This portrait now resides juxtaposed to the portrait of Dr. Blaylock, really memorializing this incredible partnership, if you will allow me to say mentorship, and then friendship that evolved between these two individuals. You can see the juxtaposition of Vivian Thomas as a lab technician, lab supervisor, and Dr. Blaylock. We know that this is the procedure for which not only the fame was garnered, but the introduction of a brand new approach in cardiothoracic surgery. Arguably, this recognition that you as a society have decided to bestow on the legacy of Dr. Thomas is more than just about congenital heart disease surgery. It really did usher in a new era in your domain, in your field, that still thrives today. Now, what do we know about Dr. Thomas? I am wont to call him Dr. Thomas, as Hopkins did afford him a doctorate of laws, plural, before he succumbed. And I think it's appropriate that we refer to him as Dr. Thomas. He's from Louisiana, so I certainly connect with that. Grandson of a slave. He was educated in Nashville, Tennessee, in a high school that now bears the namesake of Martin Luther King Jr. High School. He did not have enough money when he finished high school to go to college. His ambition immediately was to become a physician, and so he became a carpenter, and he was actually working at Fisk University in Nashville, Tennessee, a university where I spent a summer studying between my freshman and sophomore years in college, preparing to take the MCAT and go to medical school. It is a traditional, historically black college university. He didn't excel as a carpenter. In fact, he was chastised by the supervisor because his work was shoddy. It was pointed out once that he could do better. And in his own words, he said from that point forward, he got the message. And everything else he ever did, everything else he ever touched was about excellence. He then transitioned to a different job, serving as a carpenter's apprentice on the campus of Vanderbilt University. still trying to realize his dream of going to college. This was in early 1929. He actually started college at what is now known as Tennessee State University, another historically black college university with which I'm very familiar and have studied there during my undergraduate years. But then immediately had to withdraw once October 1929 occurred. When that occurred, he immediately had to look for some sort of sustenance. He exhausted all of his savings, and he found himself back on the campus of Vanderbilt, this time in Dr. Blaylock's employ. It must have been an odd circumstance. Two men from vastly different perspectives sitting on bar stools, discussing a job in a lab, a laboratory function that Dr. Thomas had never served, working for a man who arguably was known as somewhat of a contrarian, maybe even a tyrant. But yet they found some symbiosis. And after Dr. Thomas prepared the first dog experiment, everything else fell into place. In order for that employment to work, he had to be hired as a janitor, even though he was working in a laboratory. And although we recognize the contribution based on congenital heart disease, the contributions arguably were even more so in the elucidation of mechanisms of shock and the acute treatment of shock, which during the war era was an incredibly important public health issue. In 1941, the two of them left Vanderbilt and moved to Hopkins. It's interesting when you read the accounts of this, because the team at Hopkins very much wanted Dr. Blaylock. And he said, I have a package deal. And they told him no package deal, and he said, well, I'm not part of the deal. And it was through his steadfast support of Dr. Thomas that the two of them moved to Hopkins. But what about this discrimination, segregation, bias thing? What was the evidence of such? Well, first, working as a laboratory assistant, paid as a janitor. Second, when he moved to Baltimore, he actually had to live in Oliver, Baltimore, which is a suburb that is adjacent to Hopkins. I've been to Hopkins a number of times, and I know that area, and it is not an area that has a warm history. All of the pictures that show him at Hopkins never showed him in the front door. He always had to enter by the side door. Things were so polarized during that time that he wore his white coat in the lab, but had to change into street clothes to go from the lab to visit with Dr. Blaylock because of the scorn and criticism he would receive just walking the halls. Even from Dr. Blaylock, there were issues of concern. He was never listed as a co-author on one of the papers. Think about today's world. If there was someone in your laboratory helping you fundamentally discover a new realm of science and you never acknowledged that person in one of your papers. All of the group photos of the many legions of physicians that were trained never included Dr. Thomas. He required part-time work to support his family. Working as a bartender, in fact, ended up working at the 60th birthday party for Dr. Blaylock just so that he could attend. It was 1976 when he received this honorary Doctor of Laws, and then after 37 years at Hopkins, he received a faculty appointment as Dr. Higgins described. I point this out to you so we can get a sense of the deep character, integrity, and ethic of this man who, despite these obstacles, decided to rise above and continue to work on what he thought was noble and just. So what are the lessons that we can learn from this very compelling story? I would suggest that everyone in this audience knew something about Vivian Thomas walking in the door. But now you know a little bit more. But let's help frame this context in a different way. Could history actually repeat itself? In other words, can we begin to take what we have observed from this story and make the case that there is something particularly important, particularly necessary in a contemporary organization like STS, like the American Heart Association, American College of Cardiology, to make the case for diversity and inclusion? So let's begin here. I want to take you through a series of thought experiments and let you calibrate your responses accordingly. What are your thoughts when you see these images? Here's the first image. Here is the second image. The third image. The fourth. And the fifth. And this was uniquely about the crime situation in Chicago. That is, African Americans make up 13% of the population, but commit more than half of all the murders, and 93% of black murder victims are killed by other blacks. When you look at these images and you listen to what I've just suggested, did you think about immigration, building a wall, nationalism, bias, anger, or did you think about questions of equity? Did you think about questions of social justice or injustice? Did you think about the social determinants of health? The reason I just took you through that exercise is that those images are all very powerful. Those narratives are all very provocative. If you allow yourself to think fast, as Daniel Kahneman, a Nobel Peace Prize winner in economics, would suggest, then you're responding reflexively to experiences in our environment and our experiential life that connect a visceral emotion with an image. But if you think slow, you pause, you cogitate, you realize that there's more depth, there's more substance there. Here's another thought experiment. Look at this visual depiction of words that are used over and over and over again in this domain of diversity and inclusion. What is equal? What defines equity? But what is the reality? If you look at this, you recognize that when we're talking about a goal, a strategy to achieve equity, we have to get to a point where whatever the objective is, in this case is cheating to see a baseball game, but whatever the objective is fairly accessible to everyone. But then you become compelled by the reality that many people don't even start at ground zero. They start in a hole. And so that is the struggle that we face. When we're talking about diversity, it's important to be definitional. Mark Nevitt is now here in New Orleans, but previously was with the AAMC. In 2011 and then again 2015, he published these definitions. The first definition is straightforward. It's just an awareness that things are strikingly different. And the presumption is that that has to do with the impetus for many of our social justice movements. Think about a woman's right to vote. Think about a woman's right to choose. Think about civil rights. It all began because there was something that was starkly different, something that was starkly unique. Version 2.0 was to try to be particularly engaged and, if you will, overcompensate, to work towards trying to correct this quickly. Many of those kinds of targeted programs, affirmative action being one, were not successful. But then there's version 3.0, and I've highlighted a couple of points here. Let me dismiss a myth. Whenever any of us are engaged in conversations about diversity, we assume that that subjugates us to a system not based on merit. Following a path towards diversity is in fact a way towards excellence. Corporate America has figured this out time and time and time again. And it's time for us in medicine to understand that as well. We recognize that when we in healthcare, we in medicine, think about diversity, Our goal really is to think about a way to improve health outcomes, a way to acknowledge the differences in our population, a way to do better science. And then finally, when we think about diversity, we really are targeting the critical link. What can we do to improve the pipeline? Before I go to the next graphic, I want everyone to focus their eyes on me for a minute. Not on the images on the screen, but focus your eyes on me. What you see is someone kind of tall, bald for a really long time, pretty much a scraggly beard. But what you really see is a black man. What you really see is someone that is traditionally described as a minority. Well, what is a minority? If you take a look at these data, it really gives us another definition. Effective today, for persons in this country under the age of 18, there is no longer a majority population. We have become a country of pluralities. If you are to be successful just as a business enterprise going forward, you must acclimate and accommodate to a new reality. Our environment, our world, our demographic is a very different place. The traditional terms of a majority population and a minority population are being radically revisited, reshuffled, and redefined. So the first thing I'll tell you about making the case for diversity and inclusion, because remember, that's the perspective I'm taking. I'm looking at the legacy of Drs. Thomas and Blaylock, the complexity of their relationship, and I'm saying this is an excellent opportunity to really make the case for diversity and inclusion. So the first statement is simply this: if for no other reason, our demographics are changing. And I haven't even begun to mention immigrant populations, those persons that are coming from other countries that have faced a different kind of negative inertia to come to this country, particularly to practice medicine. And so let's say that's point one. Well, let's continue. I spent the afternoon going in and out of a number of sessions, fascinated to be amongst your membership and to listen to your perspective. I found it odd that I went to a heart failure session and not once did I hear ACE inhibitor or beta blocker or ICD, and I thought, where did I go? But nevertheless, I also went to one of the sessions on aortic stenosis. And TAVR has really been a remarkable experience. But what about evidence of cardiovascular disease disparities and the deployment of TAVR? This TVT registry report, I think, is seminal. It was published just last year. I know about half of these authors on first-name basis and had a number of conversations with them as these data were coming forward. Look at the vertical axis. It's truncated at 5%. That 5% would be the percent of underrepresented minorities receiving TAVR. It's truncated at 5%. For those self-described individuals that are black, it's 1.6% of TAVR operations. That is a pause moment, 1.6% of procedures. Look at these data, same paper, almost a meteoric increase in the number of centers performing TAVR, and not one inflection point in a change in the percent of underrepresented minorities receiving those procedures. I will remind you, just like in my institution where we are a leading center in TAVR, these decisions are made by a group of individuals. Every time we make decisions, we bring certain templates of thought into the room. Look at these data. I will draw your attention to the right upper quadrant, which is looking at the geographic heat map, if you will, of TAVR procedures done in non-Hispanic blacks. It is not a surprise that in the areas that are typically underserving minorities, including this state of Louisiana, my home state, you see least utilization of this technology. To be fair, in this paper by Wayne Batchelor, a very talented African-American interventional cardiologist, this is now at Inova, There are a number of variables in this equation: patient-level factors, healthcare system factors, and disease-related factors. But in this whole domain is this very worrisome issue of how do we make our decisions. This paper was just published last month, and it is a brilliant description of what we think we know about critical AS. So, for example, many underrepresented minorities show up with advanced left ventricular dysfunction. The incidence of calcific aortic stenosis is much higher in persons of European descent. Bicuspid aortic valve disease is much higher in persons of European descent. If you look at the odds ratio for undergoing TAVR, African Americans are 38%, 32% less likely, Latino Americans 32% less likely. And what is striking is that when the procedures do occur, there's absolutely no difference in outcomes. So to the extent that some of this underutilization represents the way we are thinking, the way we're making decisions, this is, if you will, an explicit example of how the concerns about the link between diversity in the workforce and healthcare disparities becomes evident. So the second point on making the case for diversity and inclusion is this. Yes, the demographics are changing, but even more so, a cogent, maybe even valid argument can be made that there is a connection between workforce diversity and the presence of disparate cardiovascular disease outcomes. So let's get to the heart of the matter. And the heart of the matter is a conversation about bias. I want to talk to you a little bit about the biology of bias, and then return to another series of thought experiments to help each of us decide, are we biased, and think about how do we see the world, and then some strategies to overcome bias. So what is the biology of bias? What is bias? It's a preference for a social group that is both unconscious and automatic. And here is the big answer to the question. If you are sitting comfortably, I'm going to make you feel uncomfortable. Because if your comfort level is that certainly I'm not biased, the correct answer is certainly all of us, me included, harbor biases. It's a function of the world in which we live, and it's a sum total of all of our aggregate experiences. As a matter of evidence, regardless of the individual's own sex or gender, the individual's own race or ethnicity, 70% of people living in this country have a preference for persons of European ancestry, particularly males. That is couched in evidence now, having been tested many times over. But there's something about bias that goes even deeper than that, and it's a phenomenon known as implicit bias. It's a tendency or inclination that results in judgment without question. That means to say there is an operative subconscious neural network that all of us have that pre-populates answers to questions before we think about them. So it's an automatic response and a shortcut that describes our interaction with the world. Look at all the different domains in which bias can occur. The way we use our language, our ethnicity, which is either Hispanic or not, race, which is black or not, or other races, culture, our perspective, our skills, our nationality, our geography. There's a surfeit of the different domains that qualify as the kinds of biases that we can have, up to and including something that's unique in academic medicine. Is someone an introvert or extrovert? We talk about IQ and EQ. And what about the academic pedigree? And we talk about, did someone go to X or Y institution? So these are unique pressures on this conversation of bias, and all of this emanates from the work of Hannah Valentine at the NIH, as she is the NIH Diversity Director. So here is the next exercise. I want everyone to take a look at this picture, and I'll be quiet for about 5 seconds. So what do you see? You see a frog, or do you see a horse? Many people see the frog right away, but it's only until you change your perspective and move your head, as this gentleman is doing, to your right shoulder and look again, and now you see the horse, because then you see the mane of the horse going horizontally from about 3 o'clock to 9 o'clock. You see the snout of the horse at about 11 o'clock. You see the ears of the horse at about 2 or 3 o'clock. And so just by changing your perspective, you see something different. What about now? What do you see? Do you see a young woman with a distant gaze looking out on the horizon? Or do you see an older woman with coarse features, with a long life lived hard? So if you're trying to sort this out, the nose is here, as I'm pointing, just above the chin of the older woman with, if you will, a buff of hair just above the nose. But the younger woman, you can see the nose and the eyelash looking out over the horizon with a feather coming from the top. So once again, it shows you that the same repository of information can lead to some very, very different ideas. This is a classic experiment in psychological literature. It's called the Hermann grid. If you look at this, you see black squares. It's okay if you do not, yes, it's not a trick. There are black squares there. But some of you, when you look at this, you see gray circles in between the black squares. And a couple of people are nodding their heads. That information is there. It's just a matter of how you process the information. Do you see what's happening here? I'm showing you different scenarios. You see the exact same images, but by changing your perspective, by taking a little bit more time to think about what you see, you're seeing more content, you're getting a different point of view. And what about here? I would argue that 90% of you flew to New Orleans for this meeting. And invariably, there's some in-flight magazine that in the back 2 or 3 pages has a brain teaser of some sort, purportedly even endorsed by Mensa. I'm not sure I believe that one. But this is the same sort of thing. There's 9 dots here. With your imaginary pencil or finger, connect all of the dots with one stroke without lifting the pen or your finger from the virtual piece of paper or screen. Your first gut feel is that, oh, that's easy to do, that's easy to do. But if you really try to force yourself to do it, is it really that easy to do? Well, it's only easy to do when you agree to think unconventionally. This is the only way you can get there. But you have to be willing to think in a different manner. And it's in keeping with the models that I'm sharing with you, changing your perspective, seeing the totality of what's there, and being willing to think unconventionally. So when you're managing your own subconscious bias, because I have given you a newsflash today, everybody, me included, functions from a position of bias. These are the ways that you do this. You consider a different perspective. You recognize the depth of content that may be present. You accept the possibility that you may have to think a different way, unconventionally, if you will. And most importantly, no matter what your gut feeling is, you check your assumptions at the door. There are a number of people much smarter than me that have written thoughts about dealing with the pernicious influence of implicit bias. Tom Brokaw, bias like beauty is often in the eye of the beholder. Facts are your firewall against bias. Robertson Davies, the eye only sees what the mind is prepared to comprehend. Benjamin Hayden, fortunately, for serious minds, a bias recognized as a bias sterilized. I particularly like this quote from Confucius because of the age of the quote, and it reminds us that it's been around a long time. A gentleman can see a question from all sides without bias. The small man is biased and can see a question only from one side. And then there are comments that are attributed to Nelson Mandela about our automatic pilot within our mind. This is the key consideration that I'm building up to. Every day, I make these decisions, whether it's in my outpatient clinic or when I'm rounding in the CCU, on the heart failure service. You make these decisions in a TAVR disease management meeting, in a CTICU, in the OR even. We start with the interface between patient and physician. We upload objective data, and then we use our mind's eye to interpret that information. If that interpretation is an equitable interpretation and appropriately considers the context of that patient, we're more inclined to make decisions, exercise interventions that yield green and blue stars. But if there's any chance that the way in which we process this information is influenced by bias, maybe even prejudice, we end up making decisions that yield red and black stars. So the third point in making the case is not only the changing demographics, not only the potential contribution between diversity in the workforce and disparate outcomes, but the awareness that implicit bias is ever present. It influences our decision making and it modifies our professional interactions. What about giraffes and turtles? We can't expect people with turtle views and movements on diversity to make giraffe decisions on the development and inclusion of marginalized groups in the workplace. There are multiple ways to overcome bias. I'm only going to address one this afternoon, and that is targeting diversity in the workforce, and particularly in the discovery science, since that's uniquely what Vivian Thomas was about, discovery science. I had the opportunity to sit in the Vivian Thomas Symposium earlier this afternoon and listen to a number of presentations from within STS about the work that you're doing. I applaud you for taking this on and being so forthright and dealing with it in such a direct manner. In this paper, for which Dr. Cook is a senior author, there is a result of an important survey, and I'd like to share this with you if you've not seen it. Table 1, from STS, have you ever felt unfairly treated, marginalized, or biased by your colleagues? What I really like about the survey is not the top line result, because the top line result is yes. What I particularly like is the presence of mind to have carved out a unique cohort, which is described as CT surgery workforce decision makers. And what's remarkable on this question is that whereas the other groups that were at risk said yes between 70 and 90% of the time, the people in the room making the decisions about careers, about fellowships, about faculty appointments said only 25% of the time was there evidence of unfair treatment. When the question comes to treating patients, I'm delighted to see that we all understand the ethos of practicing medicine, and across the board, we all argue, probably stridently, that it doesn't matter. There is some gradation of response, but for the most part, we argue that it doesn't matter. And then when we discuss teaching others, we see that there is the awareness now that some of us are uniquely comfortable teaching any physician, any professional from any background, whereas there's evidence that some of us have a bit more angst about this. And so these are your own data, but again, I think where the key consideration is in your leadership. And I'll get back to that in a moment. And when you think about the fact that Dr. Blaylock was one of these CT surgery workforce decision makers, you can see how explicit he was in insisting on Vivian Thomas's presence. And so the fourth point in the case for diversity and inclusion now, unique to STS, is demonstrable evidence of bias in cardiothoracic surgery. Here is a concept that reflects the way I'm going to begin to wrap this up. It's allyship. You may or may not have heard about this, but let me read the definition and show you what I'm going to emphasize. This is an active, consistent, an arduous practice of unlearning and reevaluating in which a person of privilege seeks to operate in solidarity with a marginalized group of people. That's a pretty potent statement. That's a wow statement. Look at the focus here, a person of privilege. At first glance, that makes all of us feel uncomfortable. It is a very strong social force, but it is not always negative unless it's used in a negative way. Privilege doesn't mean that you're biased, and the absence of privilege doesn't mean that you're not biased. But I would argue that everyone in this room is privileged, and here is why. Look at the list that defines whether or not you're privileged. You can go down this list, and I guarantee you there's a category on this list that applies to everyone in the room, including me. As a professor of medicine, as a chief of cardiology, as an associate director of our Cardiovascular Institute with Dr. McCarthy in Chicago, as a vice dean and a member of the medical school's executive leadership team, I am in a position of privilege. I have to be cognizant of these forces. So what do you do about that? Well, once you incorporate this phenomenon of allyship, now speaking to all of us, not you, but all of us as leaders of others, leaders of men and women, it is allyship that allows us to really address this issue of diversity. In allyship, we have the opportunity for any of us to connect with anyone else. It's not just blacks with blacks, that's not allyship. It is anyone who reaches out to connect with another person. The best mentor I ever had was a cardiologist from South Africa who emigrated from South Africa at the height of apartheid. We should have arguably had nothing but friction. And instead, he taught me how to write word by word, paragraph by paragraph. And the first one of my 500 plus publications is with Dr. Brian Firth. That's intersectionality, where someone identifies an individual with whom they will become an ally. It is a lifelong process of building trust. It is not self-defined. That is to say, it takes on an organic direction, but is an opportunity to grow and learn. This is that time of the year when we reflect on Martin Luther King Jr. And I want you to experience a lesson in allyship based on his words. Does this sound familiar? I must confess that over the past few years, I have been gravely disappointed with the white moderate. I have almost reached the regrettable conclusion that the Negro's great stumbling block in his stride toward freedom is not the White Citizens Council or the Ku Klux Klan, but the white moderate, who is more devoted to order than to justice, who prefers a negative peace, which is the absence of tension, to a positive peace, which is the presence of justice, who constantly says, I agree with you in the goal you seek, but I cannot agree with your methods of direct action, who paternalistically believes he can set the timetable for another man's freedom, who lives by a mythical concept of time, and who constantly advises the Negro to wait for a more convenient season. Shallow understanding from people of goodwill is more frustrating than absolute misunderstanding from people of ill will. Lukewarm acceptance is much more bewildering than outright rejection. At the Vivian Thomas Symposium that I attended earlier today, there was a member within you who spoke up with courage about a particular affront at a recent ECATS meeting. That member received incredible support from those in the audience. But one of the persons who spoke up echoed what I just read to you, that up until this afternoon, that person's approach was not to speak up, was not to make an issue, was not to own the experience, even though it was as disquieting for that person as it was for the person affronted. That is what we mean by allyship. We have to become, in Dr. Cook's word, comfortable with being uncomfortable. And when I say we now, I mean those of us in leadership that are responsible for managing the careers of others. So going beyond allyship, this is the key consideration, sponsorship. What is a mentor? I would argue that all of us are mentors. A mentor is an advisor, someone that can provide perspective on a younger person's role or career. A sponsor, though, is a person that can make a real difference, that can turn a dream into reality. A sponsor believes in the other person. A sponsor identifies someone and gives them his or her brand. Blaylock gave Thomas his brand. Mentors are people with whom you share an affinity, but sponsors are the people that have serious power. They are authoritative, they typically are senior, and they describe many people in this room either now or in the future of your career trajectory. You too will be potentially a sponsor. So if you're thinking about how do you incorporate this, I'm going to suggest a 3-step process. If you want to be more effective as a leader, uniquely in this realm of nurturing those persons that are coming from different perspectives, step 1 is to sit down. Step 2 is to shut up. And step 3 is to listen. It's hard for all of us to do. It's hard for me to do. But those are the first steps for effective sponsorship. So what are the strategies to control bias, since we believe that this is at the core of the kind of decision-making that impacts the career progression of marginalized groups, but also impacts decision-making and leads to disparate care? Recognize and accept that you have bias. Your impact may be at odds with your intention. Develop the capacity to use a flashlight on yourself. Be an ally, mentor, and sponsor. Have courageous conversations, and I love this. Call in with curiosity instead of calling out. Diversify. In your leadership space, diversify your speakers, your awards, your candidates, your students, your faculty. Practice diversification. Address microenvironmental, institutional, and national organizational policies and structures which are consistently keeping people in particular buckets. So now when I put all of this together and think about making the case for diversity and inclusion, I remind you that the demographics in this country are changing, point 1. I remind you that there is a reason to believe that the absence of diversity in the workforce leads to the presence of cardiovascular disease disparities. I remind you to accept that implicit bias is operative in all of us, and it influences professional interactions and clinical decision-making. I alert you to the fact that your own data shows that bias exists within your field, but you're not different from all others. And I challenge you to recognize that bias can be overcome with awareness, with allyship, and sponsorship. So thinking about our tasks, thinking about what Dr. Higgins wanted me to consider when we first had this conversation, a discussion about Dr. Thomas. Is it really a tale of discrimination, segregation, and bias?
Morning. Why would a doctor want to hire a carpenter?
This is where my work is done.
What is your work?
Medical research. Let me see those hands.
You must have got it. Oh, Vivian! He's working at a hospital, right?
Yeah.
Everyone's gonna see how smart you are.
Vivian, Dr. Blaylock wanted you to have this.
Excuse me, all workers punch in at the rear entrance.
He's with me.
Well, I'm sorry, Dr. Blaylock, but that's the rules.
Look at blew her face.
I don't think that she's breathing right now. I don't think that she's breathing.
That baby back there, how long?
6 months. Are you going to take this on, doctor?
No one's ever done anything as hard as this.
You can't operate on the heart. That's basic.
There must be a way to get more blood to the lungs.
As we focus on the pulmonary artery.
Oh, on this God's earth are you?
You got that white coat. You're just a class 3, work the same as me.
I'd like some coffee and a donut.
What about you going to medical school?
You don't have to remind me of that, Clara. We have a family now.
Let's start with experiments. Let's break their rules. You can begin the incision.
I'm not ready for that.
If I say you're ready, you're ready.
You have to see this. Vivian Thomas is operating, assisted by the chief of surgery.
Retract it.
No sushi.
Can't we try things my way occasionally? I think we've found a way to repair your daughter's heart.
Your quest for glory is vain.
Postpone the operation until you have more experience.
Postponing means signing that baby's death warrant. I'm operating tomorrow. Agent Vivian Thomas.
What's wrong? What's happened?
Agent Vivian Thomas. You want an OR right now. You're talking me through this. Scrub up.
What's he doing here?
You can resume your duties.
These are his duties. We made history together. We changed the world.
So no, the tale of Vivian Thomas is not about discrimination, segregation, or bias. It is about diversity and inclusion. It is about sponsorship. It is about allyship. This young man sat before Alfred Blaylock and simply asked for a job. And Dr. Blaylock invested in this gentleman and gave him his own personal brand equity to make a difference. This woman challenged Dr. Blaylock to do the right thing and take care of that child, Helen Tosick. I was taught to read ECGs by her protege when I spent a summer learning pediatric cardiology at Yale. And the stories about her ethic and her focus are incredible. And Blaylock was willing to be nudged and influenced by this woman. This is Levi Watkins. Levi Watkins is recently deceased. I show you Levi Watkins because whereas Vivian Thomas could not go to med school in Nashville and could not train as a physician at Hopkins, Dr. Watkins became the first African-American graduate from Vanderbilt and the first trained cardiothoracic surgeon and the first to implant an ICD with a technique that was in part informed by Vivian Thomas. And now we go from this visionary laboratory technician who just simply wanted to practice medicine and ended up in a lab at Hopkins to a chief of service at Hopkins, your president, showing that the cycle has completed itself. The more these experiences happen, the more likely we are to see significant changes on our landscape. So I'll close with two quotes. One is from Leonardo da Vinci. I have been impressed with the urgency of doing. Knowing is not enough, we must apply. Being willing is not enough, we must do. You may know that a truly famous Harvard Business School professor died this week, and his obituary was in the Wall Street Journal on Saturday. Clayton Christensen. This is my final recommendation. Think about the metric by which your life will be judged, not by your accolades, but by the people you've helped. And make a resolution to live every day so that in the end, your life will be judged a success. Thank you very much.
That was awesome. Thanks, buddy. It's great. Thank you, Dr. Yancey, for a awe-provoking and inspiring, thought-provoking lecture. We all are really honored and privileged to serve as leaders at the Society of Thoracic Surgeons. We're hopeful that today's inaugural lecture will give you pause for thought and energy for action. I want to thank you all for joining us. I hope that you found it enlightening and inspiring. We're going to break at this stage and hope that you'll head next door to the exhibit hall for the opening reception and join us in fellowship, in discovery, and in collaboration to make this a better place. Thank you very much, and we look forward to the rest of the meeting. Really enjoy it.